Hello, hope you're all well and looking forward to reading our next chapter of the Twits. And today we're going to learn about another trick that Mr. Twit, this time, or Mrs. Twit plays on Mr. Twit, and it's called the wormy spaghetti. The wormy spaghetti, and it's on page 16. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back into the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms into the spaghetti, but only in her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered in tomato sauce. Ugh! And then sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking it around with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squidgy spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit carried on eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "Ugh, it's all squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it a bit bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten a whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had such a nasty bitter taste." "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. "Ha ha ha ha!" That wasn't very nice, was it? And that was what Mrs. Twit gave her husband for lunch. Do you want to see a photograph? Now, I hope your lunch is a little bit better than Mr. Twit's is. And next time, I'm going to read you The Funny Walking Stick. So, bye-bye till then.